Our first speaker is David C. Schindler. He's an associate professor at Villanova University, where he has taught for over a decade. Sorry. He studied at the University of Notre Dame, at the John Paul Institute in Rome, and at the Catholic University of America, where he received his doctorate in philosophy. He's the author of 2 books, of almost 20 articles, and of more translations than I had time to count. His topic today is Ever Ancient, Ever New, Jesus Christ as the concrete analogy of being. Please join me in welcoming David C. Schindler.
Thank you. Just a couple of caveats before I begin. This paper is a bit abstract. I want to apologize ahead of time. But it's metaphysics, so I don't know what you can do. And I'm going to summarize the middle section, which is the most abstract part, rather than read it. You can take my word for it. It's brilliant. It's fantastic. But I'm not going to read it. I'll just sort of summarize, and that'll help me stay within the time constraints. And then the second caveat is this is a sort of an exploratory argument. So some of the things claims I make here may in fact be wrong, and I welcome a challenge on any of the points. So part 1 is the ugly ditch and the leap of folly. In the 18th century, G.E. Lessing posed a radical challenge to traditional Christianity by confessing to see, quote, an ugly, broad ditch between what he called the contingent truths of history and the necessary truths of reason. Merely contingent truths, he maintained, can have no ultimate significance for man. If Christianity is to be a matter of ultimate significance, then it must be true specifically for reason, and to that extent can relate only accidentally to the events of history, among which, of course, lie the life and death of Jesus Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, for Lessing, can have religious significance only insofar as he makes evident what has always and everywhere been true, independently of his revelation. In a word, Christ is accidental to Christianity, at most simply a vehicle of communicating a universal truth. Soren Kierkegaard, about a century later, famously judged that Lessing found himself unable to cross the ditch simply because he had old, feeble legs. What we need for the leap are not the legs of reason, but the ever-young legs of faith, the essential energy of which comes from the wholehearted, if not whole-minded, embrace of paradox. It is indeed an absurdity, an affront to reason, to say that God enters time and makes himself accessible only therein, so that, quote, a historical point of departure can be the basis of eternal consciousness. But this is the central claim of Christianity. We cannot dismiss this claim without surrendering everything else. Jesus is not accidental, but the very heart of Christianity. And to put the matter in the idiom of Martin Luther, reason can go to hell. These two thinkers place us before an apparent dilemma. Either we affirm the rationality of Christianity and thus make the figures of salvation history simply illustrative of universal truths, or we affirm the utterly unique significance of the Incarnation and thereby deny the significance of reason. But the premise of this conference, which is drawn from Gaudium et Spes, squarely rejects the terms that give rise to the dilemma. According to the conference announcement, Jesus Christ not only reveals man to himself, but insofar as man recapitulates and so in some sense fulfills the diverse dimensions of reality, Jesus reveals the meaning of being simply. It is crucial to be clear about the meaning of the verb reveal here. It can't mean simply to make known or to illustrate, in the sense that the meaning of being would already be given as something permanent and so previously fixed. And Jesus would come then only to report what that meaning is. If this were so, we'd find ourselves obviously on Lessing's side of the ugly ditch. Kierkegaard was right to insist that the Incarnation, for all of its historical particularity, is not accidental but essential. even if we have to go farther than he and say essential to the meaning of being, and so in some sense to reason, and not merely to faith alone. And so we see the extraordinary character of the claim being made by this conference, which gives rise to the question that I'm going to pursue in the paper. How can an event in history, which as such is a free human act, be not only illustrative, but in some sense truly generative of the meaning of being? It's, of course, not possible to answer this question fully in 25 minutes, or even really to spell out the entire question. So I'm just going to try to make sort of a schematic and beginning of a response to that. And so the second section here that I'm going to summarize is on the analogy of being. So in sort of a nutshell, analogy has many senses. In general, analogy, as you may know, is a mean between unity and diversity, univocity and equivocity. In the 20th century, there was a shift in the understanding of analogy from the field of semantics as a theory of meaning to metaphysics, so that analogy describes not only our language or our thinking about being, but in fact describes the way being is. Now, the way that I am going to be, the way that I understand the term and am using it here is inspired above all by the philosophy of Ferdinand Ulrich and Balthasar, is the following. Being is not defined in itself. It's not a self-referential, self-contained quantity, as it were, that's defined then over against or indifferent to the many things that are, but rather being is defined and therefore has its meaning only in and through the various things that are. And so to affirm the analogy of being is always to insist on the simultaneity of unity and difference. There is one being, one meaning, but that meaning includes the many things that are. I told you this would be abstract. Being transcends beings in an inclusive rather than exclusive way. And so, because it transcends beings in an inclusive way, it, in a certain sense, depends on their meaning for its own meaning. Now, that can be elaborated, and it is in the paper, but what I want to point out is that this principle has implications for the significance of time and history. Beings exist in time. Being itself, insofar as it transcends being, in a certain sense, transcends time. Beings exist in time, and so they do, in fact, in an ever new way. The nature of time is that no one moment is ever the same as the previous one. Every moment is, in a certain sense, absolutely unique. If we take that point back into our understanding of analogy, what this means is that in a certain respect, because being includes the meaning of beings and its meaning, in a certain respect, every being that exists gives being a meaning that it never had before. That's sort of the diversity. Every single being that exists, in a certain sense, gives being a meaning it didn't have before. And at the same time, that meaning is a supratemporal meaning, insofar as being itself transcends the things that exist in time. And so there's the simultaneity of unity and difference means that the meaning of being is ever ancient and ever new. There's a certain tension in the meaning of being. It has a kind of an already and not yet sort of structure. We can say that being is always more than itself, and this more than itself includes the novelty of history. So if you think about this already not yet, you see that analogy is something, when it's understood metaphysically, is something essentially dramatic. And I would like to suggest that the sense of drama increases when we realize it's not only what things are in their uniqueness that gives a new meaning to being, but in fact what things do. Their temporal existence is their action in time. So the activity of things, action in history, I submit, makes a genuine contribution to the meaning of being. Now, this is true in a general way. It's true for all things, but not all things or all actions are equal. To sort of conclude this section, I want to point out that it's the case that though everything that exists discloses the meaning of being in a kind of a creative way, clearly the higher and more perfect a being is, the more decisively it contributes to and discloses the meaning of being. And as you go higher up in the hierarchy of being, that the action in time that discloses the meaning of being includes freedom. Now, again, all this is spelled out in much more convincing detail in the paper, but that's part 2. So part 3 is Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So we have finally arrived at the point at which we might fruitfully address the dilemma we raised at the outset. Our reflections above enable us to see that the dilemma between the ugly ditch and the leap of folly follows from a failure to recognize the radical difference between time and supratemporality, a difference that allows them to be intrinsically connected rather than extrinsically opposed. Reason requires an intelligibility that transcends time, but transcendence of time does not necessarily imply the exclusion of time, or the contingency and freely performed action connected with time. So we have suggested that the analogy of being means that being in some basic respect awaits and so receives its own meaning from the many things that are. Moreover, we saw that the higher a particular being is, the more decisively it reveals that meaning and indeed contributes, in a certain sense, to that meaning through its own actions. Now, according to our faith, Jesus Christ possesses human nature in its perfection, which is why we can say with the Second Vatican Council that Jesus Christ reveals man to himself. If man is what is highest in nature and so supremely revelatory of the meaning of being, the perfect man is the paradigm of this revelation. But even more so, we would have to see that the historical action of Jesus is intrinsic to this revelation. There is no separation between who Jesus is and what he does. This means that the events of salvation history have metaphysical significance. Indeed, the free acts, the most concrete gestures in the life of Christ, the tender embrace of the children, the angry overturning of tables at the market, the loving look at the rich young man, the anxious prayer in Gethsemane, and so forth. Each of these gives meaning in a creative way to reality simply. It is not an accident that St. Paul speaks of Jesus Christ as coming in the fullness of time. His coming does not take place in a random moment of history, the pure contingency of time on which Lessing's objection was founded, but rather in a moment that, as supremely revelatory of the supratemporal meaning of being, in some sense precedes the unfolding of history, so that this history can be read as an unfolding of this fullness. Jesus Christ, who lived and died in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, is the same yesterday, today, and forever, because he is the concrete analogy of being. But this is only the beginning. Karl Barth was right to insist that God cannot be subsumed under the analogy of being, even if Barth's inference that the analogia entis must therefore be rejected and replaced by the analogia fidei was just disastrous in my opinion, and that of many others. And this remains the case even given the more paradoxical reading of analogy that we have been proposing. At the same time, however, Jesus is not outside, God is not outside of the analogy. By taking on flesh, the eternal Son entered into the analogy of being in some definitive way as one being, one instance of being among others, which is incidentally why I think the most decisive reason why a Christian cannot accept the terms of Heidegger's critique of ontotheology. Here we see the metaphysical import of the Church's dogmatic formulations regarding Christ. Jesus Christ is not only a particular being that exercises agency in history and so reveals the meaning of being, a meaning that transcends him in his particularity, but at the very same time as a divine person and so as eternal, he precedes created being itself and therefore includes within himself, in a certain sense, what transcends him. So what implications does this have for the meaning of being? The barest consideration suggests that the implications are endless. In the present context, we can only point schematically to some of the consequences with the hope of unfolding them sometime in the future. As eternal, and so as preceding even the supratemporality of being, even while at the same time entering into the analogy as one being among others, Jesus Christ not only gives meaning to being as the paradigmatic expression thereof, but more radically gives meaning to the relationship itself between being and beings. That is, to the ontological difference, if you will, to use Heidegger's term, for the relationship between being and beings. Specifically, he gives this relationship a personal meaning, and he does so not simply as an absolute first principle, more absolute than created being itself, but as a son, as the eternal Son of the Father in the unifying difference and differentiating unity of the Holy Spirit. According to Gaudium et Spes, Jesus Christ reveals man to himself and so discloses the ultimate meaning of being precisely as making manifest the love of the Father. The personal meaning he gives to the ontological difference is that of love. In other words, the revelation of Christ invites us, and indeed enables us, to view the reciprocity of principles that constitute worldly being as a dramatic image of the Trinitarian exchange of love. When we do so, we come to see that the ultimate meaning of being is love, and therefore that love has an ontological weight, the density of reality. It is not uncommon since Hegel to talk about Jesus Christ as the concrete universal. He is universal because he bears on the meaning of all things, that is, they have their significance ultimately in some relation to him. And he is concrete, on the other hand, because he is not a transcendent abstract idea, but a particular human being in history. But to call Jesus Christ not the concrete universal, but the concrete analogy of being, it seems to me, includes all of that, but does so while striking a different note. In a word, I think the second formulation, Jesus as the concrete analogy of being, more decisively indicates a fundamental generosity. Viewing the ontological difference as an image of love sets into relief the reality of difference that poses no threat to, but rather enhances unity. Being is ever more than itself, as we said, which implies not only that things open up from within to an ever higher meaning, and this is how people typically describe analogy, things sort of opening up to an ever higher meaning, but it also means that the ultimate meaning of being always has room for another contribution from below. Let the children come to me, Jesus said. Jesus Christ is not only is the ultimate meaning of things, but at the same time truly gives meaning to things. And perhaps the most radical form of this gift is to receive meaning from them. This is the essence of analogy, and it is also an essential aspect of love. Indeed, we might say that the analogy of being, thus understood, is love, translated into the terms of metaphysics. To affirm that Jesus Christ is the concrete analogy of being, then, is not merely to claim that he is a paradigmatic representation of a meaning, or that he simply makes known the general truth that being is analogical. Rather, we must say that he is the analogy, which is to say, as Heidegger might put it, Jesus' analogies. In more concrete terms, Jesus Christ manifests the meaning of being as love, but love is always at some level a personal relation with a particular subject and object. While revealing the meaning of being as love, Jesus Christ at the same time causes it, so to speak, by opening access and in fact being the way to the principium et finis amoris, the Father, the original font of love, in which the world was both created and redeemed. Jesus is love as the logos that binds the world to the Father and the Spirit. So what does this have to do with Catholic contribution to metaphysics? These reflections are only bare indications of paths for thinking that are opened up by the recollection of the centrality of Christ in Vatican II and the mutual fructification of philosophy and theology that this recollection enables. On the one hand, the integration of theocentrism and anthropocentrism in Christ invites our grateful and ever surprised reason more deeply than it expects into the mysteries of faith, so that it comes to see that these mysteries speak in a truly meaningful way to it, to reason, without surrendering their character as mysteries. On the other hand, the light of the most foundational theological mystery of the Incarnation illuminates an astonishingly rich and dramatic sense of being that is capable of entering into fruitful dialogue not only with representatives of the classical tradition, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and so forth, but also, for example, with the major thinkers of the modern era who have inquired so profoundly into the importance of history and time for our conception of reality, namely Hegel and Heidegger. Here we may indeed speak about a Catholic contribution to metaphysics and say that what it contributes is precisely Catholicity. That is, in form, a whole embrace of tradition along with an openness to the modern insights that deepen the tradition, and in content, a truly comprehensive notion of being, and therefore a notion of being that is analogical, ever greater, which includes the whole, katholon, both in intensive depth and in historical extension. It is only such a conception that can be adequate to the needs of our age, whose forgetfulness of God is inextricably bound up with a forgetfulness of being. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker is Adrian Walker. He studied at the University of San Francisco and at the Gregorian University in Rome, where he received a doctorate writing a dissertation on Maximus the Confessor's understanding of creation and human freedom. He taught philosophy and theology here at the JP2 Institute. He's currently an associate editor of Communio. He's done a lot of translating from Spanish, Italian, French, German, including even something some of you may have heard of, this little book right here. He's currently working on a translation of Hans Urs von Balthasar, but also on a book on Maximus. His title today is Christ, Being and Love. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Walker.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm also delighted that I actually have a paper for a change. And I'm delighted that there's a kind of a profound convergence between what I'm going to say and what David just said. So my assigned topic, the coextensiveness of being and love, that's a quote from the conference invitation, seems at first glance to have nothing to do with the Second Vatican Council. This appearance of irrelevance dissipates, also in light of what David said, but when we ponder a conciliar text that John Paul II saw as a key to understanding Vatican II as a whole. I'm referring, of course, to the now famous second sentence of Gaudium et Spes 22, which says, Christ, the last Adam, in the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully manifests man to himself and lays open his most high calling. It's been pointed out that the Council Fathers are echoing Henri de Lubac's statement in Catholicism that in revealing the Father and in being revealed by him, Christ completes the revelation of man to himself. Consciously or unconsciously, de Lubac himself is echoing, among others, Maximus the Confessor, who in the 60th of his Questions to Thalassius writes, "The substantial logos of God himself, having become man, both made luminously manifest, if it is licit to say this, the inmost ground of the paternal goodness, and showed in himself the end for whose sake creatures, in accord with divine wisdom, took their origin towards being." I'll be relying often on Maximus in what follows because he gives the Christocentrism, or perhaps we could say the Christotelism, and I'll explain a little bit what that means, of Gaudium et Spes 22, a solid anchoring in tradition. And people who think de Lubac is an innovator in a bad sense should be aware of Maximus. In the very revelation of the Father, Gaudium et Spes 22 tells us Christ fully reveals man. It's not just that Christ reveals the Father and man together. Their togetherness, their communion, is itself the context in which both are revealed to the full, the context in which both are displayed at their original best. And this display isn't just a show. I mean, it involves the novelty of action that David was talking about. For the same reason, this communion is the telos. It's the telos both of God's ad extra self-communication and of our and all other things coming into being. And the connection between us and being has been explained a little bit by Dave, or between us and other things. We could talk here about Maximus's idea that man is a microcosm and mediator, for example, but I'm not going to do that here. I want to focus instead on my main thesis, which is this. If the communion between God and man is a communion of love, if God and man are at their original best by loving each other, then their love too is the telos par excellence, the manifestation of our and all things being at their original best, at their being most, you might say. Christ himself not only accomplished but also was the communion between God and the creature, in which both appeared at their original best. And who would deny that love was at the heart of what appeared there? I mean, I don't think you could contemplate the figure of Christ and deny that. Benedict XVI's statement, which is cited in the letter of invitation to the conference, that our major task now is, first of all, to bring to light God's priority again, reminds us that if the Father chooses to reveal himself to us at all, his chief motive can only be that it is good that he be revealed. Not in the first instance good for some extrinsic purpose, but just good in itself. The radiant manifestation of the Father's unique glory that Maximus talks about can have no justification or raison d'être greater than itself. Indeed, it is its own chief justification and raison d'être, its own highest good, as it were. And yet, Gaudium et Spes 22 seems to be telling us, it is precisely the reception and reciprocation of the Father's revelation of his own non-functionalizable glory that fully manifests man to himself. Note the words ipsi homini in the second sentence that I quoted in the Latin. We could translate them as to man's very self. Christ reveals man to man's very self. It's as if there's a connection between the Father's very self, revealed in its naked glory, and man's very self, manifested in its naked glory, which comes from recognizing the magna gloria of the Father for what it is. It comes from glorifying and thanking him as God, as Paul says in the letter to the Romans. When man discovers his capacity to appreciate God in himself and for his own sake, he simultaneously discovers that God appreciates him, man, in himself and for his own sake. And so, in his communion with God, man discovers his own world-transcendent dignity. I think in a way that's just an unfolding of what Gaudium et Spes 21 says, which is important to read in conjunction with 22. Anyway, this consideration suggests that the absolute goodness of the Father's self-manifestation does not contradict its relative goodness for us. It is precisely in displaying his love for us that the Father displays his unique, non-functionalizable glory. The very fact that the Father should want us not only to be, but also to belong to him forever, reveals his paternal glory in all its sovereign majesty. Now, the astonishing thing is not just that the Father should love us, that's astonishing enough, nor is it just that we should receive and reciprocate his love, also astonishing. It's also that the Father should want our reception and reciprocation. The Father doesn't need our love by nature, yet he freely condescends to need our love, without ever making us feel that he is grudgingly doing us a favor, let alone throwing his generosity in our face. Charles Péguy, the poet Péguy, ponders divine love's dependence on the creature, a dependence that's a fruit of a freedom beyond necessity and contingency in the portal of the mystery of hope, where he says, "He who loves falls, places himself under servitude, under a yoke of servitude. He depends on the one he loves. Yet it's that situation, my child, which God has put himself in by loving us." Péguy goes on to say a few pages later, terrifying love, terrifying charity, terrifying hope, truly terrifying responsibility. The Creator needs his creature. He has put himself in the situation of needing his creature. And there, Péguy is saying in a poetic, although precise way, what David was saying about the analogy and having room for a real contribution from below. So Péguy's meditation on love's dependence brings me back to my main thesis, the communion between God and man, and I've just tried to describe its spirit a little bit. And therefore their mutual love displays them both at their original best. And so is the telos of all beings, both ontologically and historically. Obviously, I can't demonstrate this claim. Who could? Let me at least try to illustrate its meaning. Suppose there were a business, let's say one that makes bicycles, whose boss, I'll call him Mr. Jones, treated his employees fairly. We would certainly be entitled to say that Jones's bicycle company embodied a certain kind of friendship gathered around a certain common good. But suppose that Mr. Jones's cousin, Mr. Brown, also owned a bicycle company, but that unlike Jones, Brown wasn't satisfied with treating his employees fairly. Let us suppose instead that, being slightly mad, Brown not only wanted his employees to become co-owners of the company, but that he intended to adopt them into the Brown family so that they could inherit the business when he, Brown, was gone. Totally nuts, right? Jones's bicycle company, that's the cousin that's just satisfied with being decent, would embody a certain friendship, but friendship, and one of a very special kind, would actually be the point of Brown's company. It would be, or at least co-constitute, the common good of the Brown Bicycle Works. By the same token, even if Brown's company contained the same material elements as Jones's, down to the water coolers and the company pens, they would all serve a different telos, all those elements. And in that sense, Brown's company as a whole would differ formally from Jones's company as a whole. Of course, the more freedom of action and the more imagination that Brown had, the more he himself would be likely to select the company's material elements, and if possible to determine their look, which is to say their eidos, their form, in view of the telos he intended for his company, especially if he had conceived the business initially, if I may put it like this, as an honorable pretext for adopting employees as heirs. Okay, the point of this illustration should be clear by now. If the Father creates the universe out of nothing for the sake of a communion of love between himself and man, then this communion must be the telos in view of which he conceived the logoi, the ideas of creatures in the first place. Maximus the Confessor makes the same point a few lines before the ones that I cited at the beginning of the paper. Referring to the hypostatic union, which is really the new and eternal covenant of communion between God and man, ever ancient, ever new, the confessor writes that it was looking towards this end that God produced the essences of the beings. Maximus isn't saying, of course, that communion between God and man just happens to be the goal for which the Father just happened to design, maybe mechanically, his creatures. Generally speaking, before a telos can be a goal, it must be an intrinsic plenitude of perfection. A being's telos is its goal because it is first the full display of that being at its own original best, at its own being most. Similarly, the God-man communion can only be the goal towards which the Father looks, as Maximus says, if it is or includes a display both of himself and of his creatures at their own original best. It's not that the Father had to give himself and us the telos of communion. He didn't have to do anything. It's that the intrinsic goodness of that communion is itself the best index of the paternal freedom to create and redeem. Just as the intrinsic goodness of a work of craft is the best index of the craftsman's non-deliberative inventiveness. Like Aristotle says, art doesn't deliberate. The telos isn't just the goal or motive of the divine efficient cause. It's also the masterwork whose perfection reveals the whole of his original power. Indeed, is his whole original power revealed ad extra. Revealed, the whole of it is revealed, although it's not revealed exhaustively, totaliter. It's totum, but non totaliter. And here there would be a whole meditation sort of connecting with what David said about how this work, which culminates in what Christ does on the cross and so forth, by virtue of its being the work of a divine person, really, in some sense, does precede creation. I mean, I think that's really an important point. But the thing that I want to emphasize here is the mystery that the Father reveals himself at his original best, which also means at his most inventively artful, in the redemption, where he uses sin's undoing of creation against its own intention, turning it into the unlooked-for occasion of creation's renewal. By the same token, it's part of the Redeemer's revelation of the Father to be what Gaudium et Spes 22 calls the novissimus Adam, the last Adam, who is last because by his paschal mystery he is both the author and the first fruits of man's, indeed all creation's, eschatological renewal. The last Adam does not replace the first one. He recapitulates the first one. When Christ pronounces his free human yes to the chalice in Gethsemane, it's also the first Adam, and therefore all of us, who are in principle saying the yes that we failed to say in paradise. Or better, it's a new yes that superabundantly makes up for the original one that didn't happen. And part of the relevant newness is that in saying this yes, we show forth the full logos of our nature, as it were, for the first time, in the fullness of time that is the redemption of all time, and so the last of times. The redemption is the laborious achievement of the telos of creation, and at the very same time presupposes that achievement. Think of the pre-redeemed Immaculata who stands under the cross as co-redemptrix. That's the analogy of being. The very creature that the cross pre-redeemed so that she would be born without the stain of original sin, stands under that cross as co-redemptrix. So, communion, the redeeming Son gives the creating Father what he always wanted. The chance not just to give himself to us at his original best, but in that very act to receive us in return at our original best, and so to receive himself back along with the return gift. Could we have imagined a richer display of the whole analogia between God and the creature? than this communion of love that Christ himself is? How could he fail to be of interest to metaphysicians intent on understanding being and its transcendentals? These questions bring me back to my main thesis. If the communion between God and man displays both at their original best, and if love is essential to that display, then love, also as effective deed, is the telos, is being at its original best, is being recapitulated in its deepest truth. Contemplation, how do we know that? Well, I mean, you know, the deepest and most comprehensive way to verify this claim is to contemplate the admirabile commercium, the glorious exchange between God and man in the person of the Redeemer. So, I mean, this is in the first instance a theological claim. But how could this contemplation not include, and even in some sense be, metaphysics at its original best? I mean, given everything that we've just said. So what, metaphysically speaking, is our original best as creatures? It must be the full deployment of the principle that in us corresponds to God's loving initiative in seeking communion with us. This principle, I would suggest, is a desire for the divine source that springs from, but is coeval with, the suffering, the pathos of the divine initiative that brings us into being out of nothing. The coextensiveness of being and love begins in us as a desire for God, awakened by God's prior gratuitous initiative. A desire that as such already is communion and rests upon it. If we had time, this would be the place to consider why some of the great Thomist teachers deny any innate natural desire for the vision of God. The insight about desire that I've tried to express here would, I think, help us to show not only why such a denial is theologically unsatisfying, but also how we might do, let's call it a Lubacian justice, or a Maximian justice to the legitimate concern that inspires that denial. But that, as they say, is another story. For now, I want to conclude, and I'm with a few telegraphic remarks, which I think are even more abstract than what Dave was saying, on what we might call the constitutive role that desire plays for finite being. We tend to think of God as the object of our desire, but he is that only because he is first the subject of it. God, of course, does not replace our desiring, but as its creative source, he is more intimate to it than we are to ourselves. I would say that Aristotle already saw this. I would say that he already knew that desire is nature's constitutive referentiality to the divine source, even before it is a striving for God or for anything else. But here Aristotle himself would be a disciple of Plato. In their different ways, both glimpse a truth that in the light of creation, we can formulate like this. Eros is the essential in-betweenness of created being, which is suspended between nothingness and the infinite good. Love, in the sense of eros, whose full manifestation is simultaneous with the manifestation of divine caritas, is the meaning of created being. It's the reason why created being has any meaning in the first place. This talk of love involves, I think, the right kind of anthropomorphism, because the inextricable duality that we human beings experience in eros, which is always swinging back and forth between misery and grandeur, humility and glory, need and generosity, indifference and appetite, that duality is a window into the heart of created being. This window allows us to see all the way down to the very principle thanks to which created beings are beings in the first place, to what Thomas calls esse creatum. The fullness of esse creatum is non-subsistent. That means that there's an inseparability at the very heart of being between fullness and dependence. And that inseparability is the common root of the duality of misery and grandeur that gives both eros and created being their unmistakable flavor. Nor is this duality a problem to be gotten rid of, but as Balthasar suggests, a good beginning to be recapitulated in the redemption. The Redeemer, whose figure, as Balthasar would say, his Gestalt, unites abasement and majesty, reveals the Father's glory not by replacing his donation of esse, of non-subsistent esse, but in a sense by recapitulating it. That gets us into deep metaphysical waters. His redemptive suffering, his passionless passion, as Cyril of Alexandria would say, is the telos that simultaneously manifests the original best, both of the paternal goodness and of created esse as the similitude of the divine goodness, which is another quote from Aquinas. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking both of our speakers for their generosity and fearlessness. They both spoke far less than the amount of time that they were allotted, which means that they are allowing other people to speak. That's the generosity part. The fearlessness part is, as you know, if you've ever spoken in public, the best way to avoid criticism is just to keep going until the session is over. And this they have resolutely not done. So now we can have a discussion. I want to begin by making a point of my own, if I may, but without attempting to steer the discussion. I think both speakers have done a nice job of setting out a way in which created being deserves more credit than philosophers perhaps are inclined to give it. Creatures aren't simply stuck on this side of the ditch, but what they do has implications for what is so on the other side of the ditch. And I like that, but I'm also a little worried. So this is a question or a challenge or whatever. I'm worried about what's happening to divine transcendence in all of this. The expression of talking about God at his original best really makes me nervous, because I don't know what it means for God to be at his best. He just is what he is. He can't have a good day. And when we talk about created actions, not only disclosing, there was a lot of disclosure language in your talk, David, and that sounded like blessing, right? How what creatures do, disclose infinity. But I knew you meant more than that. It's also somehow constitutive of being, not simply constitutive of the meaning of our words and thoughts about being, but constitutive of being itself. But how could any creature be constitutive of the divine being? That sounds impossible. So these are questions that I'm raising. It's always easy to raise a question about what someone else has said. You guys can speak first, but at a certain point, then we're going to open it up to.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start. I'll just make one point. I mean, this doesn't satisfy the whole question, certainly, but just one aspect of it. Can you hear me? Is this test? There we go. All right. So, right. This is just one aspect. It seems to me if you oppose being and beings, so that saying that somehow being is that the action, the activity of beings. First of all, the reality of beings and their action, as well, has implications for being. If you oppose that, if you say that we need to protect the transcendence of being by excluding that, it seems to me what you're in fact doing is compromising the transcendence of being. That's the compromise, because there can only be an opposition if they're in competition, which means they're within the same order. So it's precisely the radical transcendence of being that allows beings to be novel. If we said that being has its meaning before beings, this is the sophisticated part that I said was really brilliant in the paper that I didn't get to read. If we say that the meaning of being is set before beings, we're temporalizing it. Before is a temporal term. It can't be before. It has the quality of transcending time, being above time, but that doesn't mean that it has to be temporally omnitemporal in every time. So that it's possible for something never to have been temporally. That once it is in precisely the way that belongs to it, which is supratemporality. So in fact, this always having been includes that novelty of it being now in this moment in a way that in a profoundly new way. I mean, it seems to me that actually is necessitated by an affirmation of the transcendence of being. Anyway, that's just one aspect.
Can I just say something about? Oh, can I? I don't know if I can actually, literally. I got to be really close to it. Okay, I feel like should be reading at mass. I should feel like I should be reading at mass. No, right. I mean, I chose that term also because it's provocative. And, I mean, just a couple of things. I mean, sort of on the one hand and on the other hand. I mean, on the one hand, I think I pretty consistently said displayed at his original best, meaning what Maximus is saying, you know, the revelation of the inmost ground of the Father's goodness. And the originality there means two things, I mean, that are related. One is it's inventive, you know, like the hymn for Good Friday by Venantius Fortunatus, right? So, ars ut artem faleret, right? So that a deeper art than the devil's art would overcome the devil's art. And that deeper art displays for us, in the first instance, the inmost ground of the Father's goodness, as Maximus says. And there are very few people in the history of Catholic thought, I think, who have understood divine transcendence better than Maximus. That's the one side of it. But on the other hand, I mean, you know, it is. I mean, this gets us into the whole question about to what extent, let's say, the divine persons commit themselves in the whole, you know, gratuitous, as we agree, work of the economy, you know, in creation and redemption. And I think that a lot more could be said about that than is generally sort of recognized, and that would be a direction to go, so that the kind of interplay of eternity and novelty that you have to affirm, really, if creation is to make a difference for us, and redemption is to make a difference for us, that very novelty and eternity has also a foundation in the Trinitarian processions, and so we get into sort of Balthasarian waters there. But that's a long discussion. And the Holy Spirit, whom I certainly didn't mention, and I'm conscious of. I hope I haven't grieved the Holy Spirit, but that's really the role of the Holy Spirit for understanding, pondering that relation between novelty and eternity, you know, in God is very important. Anyway, okay, basta.
All right. Moving back and forth at the bottom here. And yeah, if you'll be so kind as to speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear.
I have two questions, one for David and one for Adrian. First, thank you so much. I will be a lot to think the next months about. I hope to have the possibility to read also.
Absolutely.
your papers. Just two different questions. I mean, to you, David, I was really impressed and touched by this point you made, also audacious, it seems to me, when you said, I mean, I follow what the moderator was talking about. I mean, this, at a certain point you use this expression, Jesus Christ, and so the mystery of Christ, the incarnation, doesn't just disclose, in a sense, an analogy of being which is already always there as, packed, no? And it has only just to be known, to be revealed, but causes it. So there is, in a sense, a transfiguration of being, which is, of course, not something, an addition of being, but which gives a new meaning, and not just discloses it, unfolds it as already being there. So my question, I guess, is if you can say something more about that, because I think it's really crucial. And but at the same time, you kept the expression. In a sense, you said Christ is the concrete analogy of being. So I guess my question is, I have problems with this definition in a sense that it seems to me it remains also important to keep a dynamic relationship between an analogy of being on a creational, if you will, sense, in a traditional sense, which is the analogy of being of Thomas and of the tradition, where, I mean, I can give you an example, just a simple example. I don't know, when I say that the worm is an image of God, I can say that in a just creational sense, because it's good, beautiful, and true, and so on, as creature, and this is the traditional way, but it's incredibly poorer than the same affirmation, the worm is an analogy of being, when I, in a sense, if you will, in a typological way, that is passing through seeing the worm as a prefiguration of the mystery of Christ, and so with all the richness of the spiritual meaning which this implies in terms of humility, lowliness, and so on, all the paradoxes which the cross reveals, and this sheds a retroactive light into the meaning, into the sense in which the worm keeps being an image of God, in a Trinitarian sense, as you were saying at the end. So, but at the same time, it seems to me that the first meaning, that is the meaning the second meaning I can see only through Christ, but this doesn't collapse into each other, in a sense, the first. So I guess my question is, how do you keep the distinction, and if you can say more about that? This is the first question. Then
Wow.
Otherwise, I'll forget. I mean, in a certain sense, I think you were answering the question as well. So I just briefly. I mean, I don't want to suggest that Christ as the analogy of the concrete analogy of being replaces a metaphysical sense of analogy. I mean, what I would want so that on the one hand you have the worm as an image of God, and now the worm is an image of Christ. But as you were saying, part of the point is that Jesus Christ reveals that being, precisely because analogy is generous, it reveals it reveals that being has its meaning in a certain sense in itself. Independently, in a certain sense, from Jesus. and that's precisely why then it contributes to the meaning of Jesus. So in the emphasis is that Jesus is the analogy, makes the metaphysical dimension of the analogy infinitely more important than it was prior to it. And there would be a lot of other things to say. Let me just say that. I think it's enough.
Doesn't that also answer the second question?
I can ask you the second
already?
question.
Okay, does this one work? No, I didn't mean it like that. I mean, I was just. I love cheap jokes. I'm sorry. No, don't. No, I mean, ask your question. Ask your question. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
I have a question for Adrian, and it has to do with Maximus
Okay.
and his recapitulation, the first stage of
Yeah.
which is the abolition of sexual difference,
Right.
and how that squares with our contemporary understanding of nuptiality as the relationship between God and man.
Well, I mean, in one way it doesn't, right? You know, yeah. I mean, in one way it doesn't, and I mean, I think you know what John Paul II has done. You know, to use a phrase that's going to come up a lot in this conference, is a development of doctrine, a legitimate one, and so forth. And so, I mean, just on the most superficial level, in a way, I mean, I'm not answering the question in profundity, but on the most superficial level, I think you could say, yeah, there's stuff in Maximus or in other people that is, you know, has turned out to be questionable. Now, having said that, I do think that what a perspective like Maximus's forces us, you know, because there's a lot of sort of, you know, pom-pomming about the theology of the body, as if, you know, as if we'd suddenly discovered that sex is divine, you know. And that's really dangerous, actually. You know, it's dangerous on a lot of levels. You know, for one thing, it inclines us to forget that part of the self-giving that would be involved there would be an acceptance of death, that, you know, another generation is coming and it's going to replace you. And so one of the things that I think Maximus does is help us to, I mean, on the one hand, to overcome that naivete, but on the other hand, to go deeper into what nuptiality itself would mean. In other words, it's not just a corrective, but if it's handled in the right way, it can help us deepen the development of doctrine that's already going on, in the sense that, you know, it's in a way, it's, I mean, a lot of this is about the resurrection, you know, that nuptiality, I mean, we do rise as men and women, right? I mean, hopefully, you know, certainly Christ rose as a male, but there's also a transformation there, which is very mysterious. And part of that transformation is that there's no more sexual begetting. That's very mysterious. I mean, so what Maximus does, I think, is help us both sort of negatively and positively, as it were, to reckon, to really deal with that, to really think about that mystery to the extent that it's possible. You know, what does it mean to rise? I mean, after you've died, you know, after you've died. So not only have you begotten, but you've gone to the very end where begetting, I mean, it's not the only end, but in a way it's the end that begetting leads to, which is that you die. You've gone to that end, it's all gone, and yet you rise again as a male or as a female. What does that mean? You know, that's very profound. I mean, because there's both a continuity, but there's also a discontinuity. That's how I would, a direction for thinking about it. Do you want to throw something in? No, I'm serious. No, I'm serious, yeah.
Thank you both for your presentations. They were excellent, especially the part you didn't read, Dave. It was very, very good. very brilliant, as you said. My question is really for Adrian. I wonder if you could clarify my thought. You very profoundly put, very concisely, what we refused in Eden, we basically regained by the yes of Christ in Gethsemane. Very, very beautifully put. And what you're talking about there is when you're talking about the first Adam and the last Adam, and you're really playing into the whole Semitic concept of corporate personality, how we're all, one can represent the many in one, and the many in one. My question is how do we, again, I guess that has to do with human freedom, because in Adam we...
Human freedom?
Yeah. Because in Adam we all die, so corporately we all die. In him we all receive original sin, and so on, and alienated from God. How can... Then what happens in Gethsemane, because if Christ is the last Adam, and he really literally is in the same place functionally, if we can put it that way, he says yes, so he says yes for us all, or does he? And the question is, of course, does that really play into universalism, salvific universalism, or what? So how do you safeguard human freedom, and yet at the same time, that recapitulation which we see in Ephesians 1:10, which has to be safeguarded, obviously, because it's critical to the whole salvific process.
I mean, Joe, that's an awesome question. I mean,
the only one I've ever said that was awesome.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, I mean, the thing is, I mean, it would be, I don't know, right now it's coming to my mind to say it would almost be blasphemous for me to claim to have a sort of an answer to that question. I guess what I want to do is highlight instead the importance of that question, because it's a question about human freedom for sure, but it's also a question about who Christ is, because how you answer the question you just raised stands or falls with how you answer another question, which is, how can this guy also be God? What does it mean for him to be God? And I think, I mean, in a way, I mean, I think one element of sort of groping towards an answer would sort of pick up on, actually, I think it was the last or the what's the word? Before the penultimate, question about that Dave was with answering. That, I mean, you have to think, I mean, it's, he's God, right? And what does God do? I mean, God is utterly transcendent, and therefore he's not in competition with us, and therefore he can be more interior to us than we are to ourselves. And if that God becomes man, then by the communication of idioms, and I hope Michael will allow this statement, by the communication of idioms, there's a way that Christ does that in and through and with his humanity. So also as man, I mean, that's one way I try to understand the whole idea of capital grace, that also as man, he's superior sumo nostro and interior intimo nostro. And then if you add the other dimension that was brought out, which I think is really crucial, which is that in coming down from above, so to speak, God leaves room for and sort of entrusts himself in a way to what comes from below. That, I mean, if you think about the extreme, weakness of Christ in Gethsemane, like Peggy says in this beautiful meditation on the agony in the garden, he says, when Christ says, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, he wasn't just instructing his disciples like a schoolmaster. He was talking about himself. That's the mystery, that weakness could be more intimate to us than we are to ourselves. That's the mystery that you're putting your finger on.
So our human freedom is God's predestined will.
That's. I know Margie's going to be talking. I think, right? You're going to be talking about predestination. So maybe we could leave that for.
What I want to ask, I think, relates to the question asked by the moderator in the beginning. I'd like to pursue that a little further. I was very puzzled by what Dr. Schindler was saying, either because I'm partly deaf, which I am, and so I missed the key bit, or because I'm rather dim and couldn't follow the argument, and I'm not sure which of these is right or both. But anyway, my question would be something like this. It seems that Dr. Schindler has got caught on some kind of dilemma, horns of a dilemma. That is, on the one hand, he seems to want to avoid something like a Spinozistic pantheism when he talked about being and beings. But I wonder whether the price he seemed to be prepared to pay for avoiding that would be that he would have difficulty in answering a question like, was Jesus genuinely tempted? In other words, the alternative pantheism might look like something like monophysitism, to use the traditional language. And may I add, just finally, before he tries to answer this, apparently probably fairly easy question, this sort of question was actually raised by Maximus Confessor. And I was delighted to hear his name mentioned in this discussion, despite his odd views about sexuality. Thank you.
Actually, before, could you clarify, it's not clear to me, how do you see the question of temptation, how do you see the question of temptation being the opposite? If you could just clarify your question a bit.
Well, I mean, I take it that because of the need to avoid secure transcendence, one has to make a sharp distinction between being and beings, but I couldn't understand quite what your distinction meant. I guess that's the point I was dealing with. It seemed that being depended upon beings in some way or other in your presentation, and that's rather puzzling. That would suggest a pantheistic relationship. But of course, if you do that, and you still want to retain some sort of transcendence for Jesus at least, then he's going to fall entirely on the transcendent side of this possibility, and that would mean he isn't really man in the sense that he's not genuinely tempted. Now, you may want to answer, he wasn't genuinely tempted, but if you say that, that puzzles me even more.
Yeah. I guess one of the main points I was trying to convey, really schematically, that would require all sorts of development, is that transcendence isn't a separation. So that the proper understanding of transcendence is inclusive of the diversity of beings, and therefore precisely in Christ, inclusive of the integrity, the full integrity of the human nature. The idea that there's a kind of to use a term that the philosopher Schelling coined, sort of an unprethinkable character to the historical action of Jesus, and that would include the drama of temptation, is not at all excluded by the meaning of being, but in a certain sense required, in a very dramatic way, required by it, was really sort of the sort of target I was aiming at in this paper.
I have a question also for Dr. Schindler. It's just if you could talk more to this, what I'm going to be saying, right? That's my question. You mentioned that what things do, action in history, make a genuine contribution to the meaning of being, right? So I understand this from the point of view of the subject or the person that acts, and therefore, since it's a genuine act, a personal act, it has to be something new. My question regards more, not so much on the personal side, but the point of view of the meaning. What does it mean to contribute to meaning, right? And henceforth, how do you understand meaning, right? went back to this theme at the end of your presentation, talking about meaning as love. So could you say more what you meant by this? Thank you.
In the middle section I keep talking about here, the try to use a metaphor of translation. So you have an original text that gets translated into another language, and if it's an ideal translation, there's a certain sense in which there's no foreign imposition on the original meaning of the text. There's no sort of external, extrinsic addition to it. At the same time, there's a sense in which absolutely every aspect of it is different. Everything is changed, but not in the way of a kind of an external addition. It's more of a bringing out from within, but not in the way of sort of simply unfolding something that was already there. So the analogy, if you will, is with being. The language of time, you could say, doesn't belong to being. It's a new language. Being is supertemporal, or more precisely, it doesn't belong to being as such, considered in abstraction from beings, but it belongs to being only insofar as being is in beings, insofar as being sort of, as it were, subsists in beings. And so you could say, in a certain sense, that history is a kind of a temporal translation of the meaning of being in a way that makes every aspect of it totally new, but not by way of an extrinsic. It's still the same text in a certain sense. So that's a metaphor that would have to be qualified in different ways, but that's sort of the principle. If I could just make one comment, though, when you talk about human action, because it's free and so therefore having a novelty that's more evident there, I would want to insist that there's something analogous to human freedom all the way down in creation, so that there is a certain sense in which E.O. Wilson, who's problematic in all sorts of ways, he talks about the flight of a bee, that we have to assume that what looks random is in fact pre-programmed in the bee. But it seems to me that's ridiculous. That there is something, you don't know which way a bee's going to go, and it doesn't know, and it's not simply programmed into it. There's a certain kind of life and spontaneity that's different from a deliberate free action in a human being, but it's analogous to it. So that the flight of a bee is something unprethinkable, something wholly new, and therefore revelatory of the meaning of being.
Can I just? When you were talking, I suddenly got an implication of what you were saying, which I think is kind of mind blowing. That, in a way, it's sort of like saying that just as the eternal Son continues to be himself in a new way when he assumes a new nature, so too essay continues to be itself in a new way when it assumes this temporal language, and not only and the just as there is not just a parallelism, but that there's all kinds of profound interconnections back and forth. Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. That's amazing.
You're too generous.
That's amazing.
Can you be fast?
I'll try.
Here. Yeah.
I'll try. The question really follows up on Professor Gorman and Risk's questions, and it asks about balancing out Nestorian and monophysicist problems. That seems to be the horns that Professor Risk was raising. And I wondered, you talked about Cyril of Alexandria, Professor Walker, the reference to the passionless passion.
Yeah.
Would you just briefly comment, and this is very difficult in a short period of time, about the communication of idioms and the two natures, the divine and the human natures of Christ, and the way in which Christ's passion may touch the divine nature or not?
Okay. Well, no. I can't really. Not in 2 or 3 minutes. I just think, that that's. I mean, you're putting your finger on a central issue. I mean, it's absolutely central. And it's related to this whole, it is really related to this whole question of, what it means to communicate the act of existence to a finite being, and I mean, what I would rather say than trying to sort of solve that would simply be to say that however you solve it, right, you have to not just balance these two claims, just like you don't balance immanence and transcendence. You have to guarantee both simultaneously and for the same reason. And that's what and when Cyril of Alexandria says that the word suffered impassibly, patiebator impassibiliter, he says, he's not explaining anything. He's putting his finger on the simultaneity, and he's saying that you lose Christianity. That's really the whole point of this. I mean, the whole point here is that all this stuff about the Vatican Council and Gaudium et Spes and so forth, the whole point is you lose Christianity as a whole if you don't sort of say that one and the same person was 100% human without any mixture at all with the divinity, and that at the same time, that being man was, if you'll pardon the expression, a temporal self-expression of an eternal person. And then you would have to get into what Dave was saying about how the relation between the eternal, the supratemporal, and the temporal, and how it's not just a top-down relationship. That's not the way transcendence works, and so on and so forth. And that would be a direction you would have to go in anyway.
Really, this will have to be the last one, I'm afraid.
Well, then let's hold up, because it's actually a complicated question. So I'll maybe talk to you after.
Yeah, and the thing is, these things are all going to come up 1,000 times again during the conference.
Okay.
This will be a simple
This will be short. This is also in the spirit of Father Lopez's question, but it's directed to Adrian,
Okay.
Which is to ask for a little bit more elaboration,
Sure.
because first, in order to understand more fully,
Yeah.
and if I can even pose it, but I think I can say enough that you will know what the point is here.
Right.
I think you said the pathos of God, referred to the pathos of God in bringing us into being ex nihilo.
No, ours in being brought into being ex nihilo. Ours, as Golem would say, ours, my love. Our pathos, our constitutive pathos in being brought into being by God, by his prior gratuitous and unlooked for initiative. That's what I was saying.
Okay, well then the question I was going to ask, and maybe there were a couple of other expressions there, but what I wanted to get at was the sense in which the act of creation is generous.
Yeah.
It's sort of, what's the distinction between generosity and telos, if I can put it that way. I mean, actually, what I wanted to get at, I mean, it goes back to something in an earlier article. I mean, it bears on this, even though it's not the same issue, but it has implications, and that's what's behind this. In terms of esse creatum, that esse is non-subsistent. That's absolutely crucial. And it's non-subsistent, but it's it's also completum.
Right.
That is, it's a perfection.
Right.
And then saying at the same time that esse is not an efficient cause.
I didn't say that.
No. Yeah. Well, you did in an earlier article. But
yeah, but I mean, yeah, but.
But no. All I want is an elaborate. What I want to get at is the sense of the character of esse as generous in the act of creation. It is what I'm raising. Is that clear? Or
yeah, it's right. It's clear, and you know, whatever. Okay, so yeah, I mean, it's absolutely it's generous. I mean, in fact, the whole point is that if a creature, right, can collaborate with God, you know, and we know that collaboration means you're priorly receptive and all of that. But if a creature can collaborate with God in bringing about a telos, right, then that precisely is a manifestation of the original generosity that's built in. That's kind of what I was trying to say there at the end, actually. I mean, that the telos is the recapitulation of the generosity, the fontal generosity that's built into esse creatum as a similitude of the divine goodness and the Father. And the middle term here is the fact that the Son, you know, is always already there, letting himself be generated by the Father. And it's in that communion that the Holy Spirit proceeds. So, I mean, the telos is precisely the inclusion, as it were, retroactively, of the product in the fontal generosity of the origin, which precisely as such displays maximally the fontal generosity of the origin. I mean, that's what I was trying to say at the end. And the whole point about pathos is that, I mean, this gets us back to what Dave was saying, that our being brought into being prior to our choice makes us be. And there's something about that experience of being brought into being ex nihilo that in the distinction of the natures reveals something about the divine nature. It reveals something about who the Son is. That's the point. You know, his ab alio from the Father, it's not a suffering in any way that we would understand it. But if we want to understand it, we have to look at the suffering that begins already in allowing himself to be incarnate of a woman so that she really is the mother of God, and then at the end when he really completely gives himself over. I mean,
are you going to, you don't want,
I'm going to
I have further questions on that from a metaphysical point of view, but
it's tough. We're going to have to stop now.
Okay, that's
but so thanks. Sorry. Okay, so our session is over, and the next session begins at 11, and it's on the Catholicity of the Council. So come back.